First of all, good afternoon. I'm very glad to be here. My name is Lloyd Ultan. I'm here on behalf of the Bronx County Historical Society. I am also the Bronx Borough historian, which makes me the official historian of the Bronx, which means if I say something, you gotta believe it. Now, I'm here basically to tell you the story of Hispanics in the Bronx. Now, most people tend to think that the migration of people from their original homeland to the American shore in terms of waves of people. First one group comes, and then another comes, and then another. In this idea, Hispanics are usually thought of as among the most recent newcomers to the Bronx. Surprisingly, the story of Bronx Hispanics can be traced back to the early 19th century. The story of Hispanics in the Bronx begins as far back as 1813. In those days, what is now the Bronx was part of County, and most of what the Bronx is today was a rural town filled with farms called the town of Westchester. Its center was in Westchester Square, and the main drag was Westchester Avenue, but it was Westchester Avenue today. Most of the people living in the area, of course, were farmers. In the year 1830, most of the country was in the middle of the War of 1812. Now, don't ask me how 1813 comes to be the War of 1812, but that's the way it is. The war is between the very young United States and Great Britain. Now, because Great Britain was the world's manufacturing center in 1813, and the United States is at war with Great Britain, manufacturing imports are cut off. So somewhere along the line, we have to make our own. To meet the need, a small village begins to grow in the town of Westchester along the Bronx River near today's West Farm Square. And manufactories were built. They made glass, they made paint, they made pottery. There was a newspaper that was published in this little village of West Farms in the town of Westchester, in Westchester County, which is now part of the Bronx. The newspaper was called the Westchester Patriot. Now, in those days, newspapers were very small. They only had 4 pages. You had a flatbed press, and you printed one side, you printed the other side, then you took the piece of paper and you folded it over and you had 4 pages. This is the very first newspaper to ever be published in the Bronx, the Westchester Patriot. It was published once a week, and on the very last page, in the lower left-hand corner, is a little box. And in the box, it is printed, published and edited in West Farms by M. Lopez. So the very first person who ever published and edited a newspaper in what is now the Bronx was this mysterious M. Lopez. Exactly who M. Lopez was, where he originally came from, and whatever happened to him afterward remains unknown. I'm still trying to find out. If anybody knows, please tell me. But he is the very first Hispanic ever to be noted as living in the Bronx. Unfortunately, his pioneer newspaper lasted only a few months. After the War of 1812, the area that is now the Bronx slowly grew. In 1841, the very first railroad penetrates into the Bronx. This was officially the New York and Harlem River Railroad, and it ran along what is today Park Avenue. Today, the line is the Harlem Division of Metro North. Was the New York and Harlem River Railroad. That's why it's the Harlem Division of Metro North. Since there were very few villages along its route, the railroad built stations at convenient intervals. In other words, this railroad was built, as most railroads in the United States were built, they were built to go from somewhere to nowhere. And along the way, they built stations. And where the stations were built, that's when villages began to form. One station was named Fordham. It was at that station that in that very same year, 1841, a brand new Catholic college was begun. It was originally called, believe it or not, St. John's College, but it is now Fordham University. Also in the middle of the 1800s, a great many people from Germany immigrated into the United States, and some Ursuline sisters from Germany established the Ursuline Academy at the southwest corner of Caldwell and Westchester Avenues, where the St. Mary's Park houses is today. By that time, the countries of Latin America had formed their own republics. Following independence, a number of wealthy people from these Latin American republics sent their sons or daughters to the United States for their education. Both the Ursuline Academy, who admitted girls, and St. John's College, who admitted boys, attracted them. From 1855 to 1892, at the Ursuline Academy, the sisters taught elementary and secondary school. Among their boarding pupils were several young women from Mexico, Cuba, and other Latin American countries. At the same time, several young men from the republics south of the Rio Grande River attended St. John's College, now Fordham University. A few of them, over the years, contracted one fatal illness or another and died there. Now, in those days, it was a long trip back home, and it was for health reasons that the person who died at Fordham had to be buried very quickly. And so, indeed, these handful of Latin American students who unfortunately died on the campus, not all of them did, they're still buried in that small cemetery that can be found on the Fordham campus today. From 1861 to 1865, the United States fought the Civil War. Following the American Civil War, the United States grew to become a leading manufacturing nation. New York was the major harbor, attracting exporters and importers from all over the globe. It was then that Inocencia Casanova y Fagundo bought property on Hunts Point from the widow of Benjamin Whitlock. Casanova was in the export-import business and came from Havana, Cuba. He renamed the huge mansion that was on the site Castillo de Casanova. In those days, Cuba was one of the few remaining colonies Spain kept in the New World. The Spanish government held their colonies very closely. They tried to regulate everything. Many wealthy Cubans, including and especially those involved in the export-import business, hated the Spanish laws because those Spanish laws curtailed their business. Many of them began a movement to bring about independence from Spain. One of those active in that movement was Inocencia Casanova. Local residents in Hunts Point thought that he probably tried to help the rebels against the Spanish army by using the vast cellars of the mansion to store arms. According to the story, he then smuggled those arms into Cuba using the nearby East River. Casanova Street in Hunts Point is named after him. In 1898, the movement toward Cuban independence led to the blowing up of the American battleship, the USS Maine, in Havana Harbor. That led directly to the Spanish-American War. I guess we're lucky we're not going to have a Yemeni-American war. As a result of that conflict, Puerto Rico was taken away from Spanish control and became an American territory. Its people became American citizens. Puerto Rico was overwhelmingly agricultural. Compared to the United States, its people were impoverished. In the early 20th century, a small trickle of Puerto Ricans began to take advantage of their citizenship and come by boat to the mainland. Quite a few of them came to New York City. The city had just expanded to include all 5 boroughs, including the Bronx. The city was rich. Jobs were available. Starting in 1904, the city began building the subway system. With the coming of the subways, the old suburban Bronx almost overnight became a densely populated urban area. Apartment houses were built within walking distance of every new subway station. At this time, however, very few Puerto Ricans came to the Bronx. Of those who did, the men first found work on the few remaining farms, and the women worked as maids. In 1920, a maid from Puerto Rico was involved in one of the earliest automobile accidents in the Bronx. She was hit by a car while crossing Prospect Avenue. Starting in 1929, both the United States and the rest of the world plunged into the greatest economic disaster in history. It is called the Great Depression. The Great Depression lasted throughout the 1930s. Factories closed, and there was widespread unemployment. In such an atmosphere, there is no reason for anyone from Puerto Rico to try to come to New York or to the Bronx. Things are just as bad here as it is there. It was not until World War II that large numbers of Puerto Ricans arrived. Poverty was still widespread on the island, and with the country at war, the economy of the mainland was expanding. Jobs and other opportunities were available. The first arrived by boat and started working in factories and offices. Many first settled in Spanish Harlem, but as more and more people arrived from the island, they found a place to live in the Bronx. At first, they settled in Mott Haven, near factory jobs. The Art Steel Company of Mott Haven, that manufactured desks and files made out of steel, was one of the first firms to hire Puerto Ricans. They actually went out of their way to hire Puerto Ricans. Soon, more Puerto Ricans began to move to Hunts Point. Some of the Puerto Ricans went into business for themselves. One of the first Puerto Rican-owned businesses in the 1940s was the Mayagüez Shoe Store on Brook Avenue, south of 138th Street. As more Puerto Ricans moved in, shops began to cater to their needs. These included the neighborhood bodegas, local Spanish-American grocery stores. Migration from the island continued in the years following World War I. The year with the single largest number of newcomers was 1953. As more Puerto Ricans arrived, they began to expand into other neighborhoods. They also expanded into other fields. Government civil service attracted many. Others joined the police force or became firefighters. The ranks of teachers in the public schools grew with increasing numbers of Puerto Ricans. Healthcare interested so many that Eugenio Maria de Hostos Community College, named for a famed Puerto Rican educator, was founded on the Grand Concourse south of 149th Street as a bilingual institution primarily to provide nurses and other medical professionals. Puerto Ricans in the Bronx also added elements of their culture to the area's ethnic mix. Cucho fritos and arroz con pollo was served at home and in Puerto Rican-owned restaurants. Starting in the 1940s and 1950s, the Puerto Rico Theater on 138th Street featured live performances by such stars as Tito Rodriguez and his marimba band, the Mexican comedian Cantinflas, and the Argentinian singer Libertad Lamarque. It became a center of Latin American culture in the Bronx. In the 1960s, the Bronx became the seedbed of salsa music. More places opened for bands to play the new music. There was Colgate Gardens, Club 310½, and the Hunts Point Palace. Willie Colon, Machito, and Tito Puente all played there. By the 1960s, the number of Puerto Ricans in the Bronx grew to such great numbers that a few became prominent in political office. Herman Badillo became the first Puerto Rican to be elected to any major city office when he was chosen the president of the Borough of the Bronx in 1965. He also became the nation's first Puerto Rican congressman in 1971. His election electrified the Puerto Ricans. Puerto Rican Roberto Ramirez currently serves as the chairman of the Bronx County Democratic Party, the first Hispanic to be chosen to lead a major party in any county in New York State. He is the first person of Puerto Rican background, also Fernando Ferrer. Fernando Ferrer first served as a city councilman and then as Bronx Borough president, and he is the first person of Puerto Rican background who was not born on the island to hold major public office. It is the usual pattern for various ethnic groups which have come to the Bronx to climb the ladder of success. This has happened to the Puerto Ricans too. Once a family in the Bronx becomes successful, the usual pattern has been for that family to make several moves to other, more upscale neighborhoods within the borough, and to eventually move out of the Bronx entirely into the suburbs. Since the Puerto Ricans were the first Hispanic ethnic group to come into the Bronx in any large numbers, they too have followed this pattern. There are an increasing number of Bronx Puerto Ricans who are moving to the suburbs today. Yet, by the late 1980s, I hate when these things stick together. By the late 1980s, the Puerto Rican population of the Bronx had grown to become the largest concentration of Puerto Ricans in New York City. It was in 1988 that the Bronx Puerto Rican Day Parade began on the Grand Concourse. Hispanics from other areas of Latin America have also come to the Bronx to make it their home, and their numbers have been increasing since the 1980s. Large numbers of people from the Dominican Republic, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama now live in the Bronx, with smaller numbers from the republics of South America. In fact, the largest ethnic group now immigrating into the Bronx are the Dominicans. In many ways, these new Hispanics in the Bronx have followed the lead that the Puerto Ricans blazed for them. For instance, there are now Mexican restaurants in the Bronx, ranging from those offering tacos and tamales to the elegant Montezuma, the first Mexican restaurant in the borough on Kingsbridge Road. Mexicans have also opened their own bodegas. They have also entered government. There is at least one prominent Cuban, at least a person of Cuban descent, who has been in government from the Bronx, Robert Esnard. Real Hispanic name, isn't it? Robert Esnard. He's of Cuban background, and he served as deputy mayor of New York City under Edward I. Koch. In all, Hispanics not only form a major ethnic group in the history of the Bronx, but they have contributed significantly to the borough's development. Take a look at business. Hispanics not only have opened small neighborhood shops, but by the 1980s, Carlos Nazario had built up his Metro beer and soda distributors to a significant size, and Carlos Nunez headed the Bronx Venture Corporation. Alfredo Tebot from Honduras founded and still owns the Bronx-based Delicioso Coco Helado. Eric A. Sterling from Santurce, Puerto Rico, began Sterling Realty in 1980 and later Sterling Appraisal Associates, and is a leading Bronx realtor. In the arts, the Longwood Art Gallery on Longwood Avenue and the Bronx Museum of the Arts on the Grand Concourse on 165th Street often feature canvases painted by local Hispanic artists. Several Hispanic artists, such as the group known as Tat's Crew, have contributed to public art through mural painting. And another art center has grown up in The Point on Garrison Avenue in Hunts Point. In music, Bronx Hispanics have contributed several noted performers. Yomo Toro has made the Bronx his home since moving there from the island in the 1950s, and he is the master of his 10-string guitar. Dave Valentine is a well-renowned flautist. Angela Bofield, a recording artist, grew up in the Highbridge section of the Bronx. Among Bronx Hispanics in movies, television, and the theater, there is Esai Morales from Brook Avenue and Jennifer Lopez from Castle Hill. In the early days of television, the character of Zorro was played by Guy Williams, a Puerto Rican from the Bronx. J.J. Gonzalez of Mott Haven became a local noted television news reporter, and is now did become responsible for the news on BronxNet, and is now a leading news figure in Channel 41, the all-Spanish cable television station. Within the Bronx itself, there is the Pregones Theater. It began at St. Anne's Church on St. Anne's Avenue on 140th Street, now located at 500 Grand Concourse. It offers live plays in both Spanish and English. In the field of sports, the Bronx nurtured baseball's Bobby Bonilla and basketball's Felipe Lopez from the Dominican Republic. There is also a growing number of writers who've contributed to the field of literature. And these Bronx Hispanic literary lights do their writing in English. For instance, Nicolasa Moore recorded the experience of growing up Puerto Rican in the Bronx in her book of short stories, El Bronx Remembered. And by the way, that book is being reissued this year. Novelist and short story writer Abraham Rodriguez Jr. recorded the time of widespread arson fires in his novel Spidertown, and of the struggles between the immigrant generation and the generation born in the Bronx in his short story collection, The Boy Without a Flag and Other Stories. Poet W.E. Rodriguez from 138th Street and Brook Avenue recalled the Bronx of the 1950s in his poetry collection, The Shoeshine Parlor and Other Poems. Another Bronx Hispanic poet is Sandra Maria Estevez, who has also published a collection of poetry. Now, you will find samples of all of these people, by the way, in a book that is just about reached the bookstores. If it isn't there, they're in there now, and hopefully in the libraries. This is a book called Bronx Accent, A Literary and Pictorial History of the Borough. This is hot off the press. This is how people in literature had seen the Bronx from colonial times today, and includes samples from all of these people I've just said. Now, for instance, W.E. Rodriguez, who I believe is probably the best undiscovered poet I've ever come across. When you talk about life as it was led, for instance, in the South Bronx, around 138th Street or so, at the time when, there was a lot of drugs and junkies were all around, he wrote a poem called Blinky, which is found in the Shoeshine Parlor, which was published in 1984, and I republished it in this book. And it's a nice, gentle story, but it gives you a flavor of what life was like in the 1950s in that area. Blinky had a glass eye that didn't fit well, but he was too poor to get another, so folks called him Blinky, the one-eyed junkie, because he was a junkie and twitched a lot, trying to keep his eye from falling out. He wasn't like other junkies who weren't like him and who hung around, wasted, waiting to score, waiting who to rob and mugging people. Angel's father's head bloodied, stabbed in the chest too, not because he fought back, but because they wouldn't take chances. Or waste time asking, and in a rush, they pushed Maria, who lived next door and was 76 years old, down the stairs. Took her pocketbook, the Social Security money, just enough to pay the rent. And buy $30 food each month. She spent 10 weeks in the hospital with fractured ribs and a broken hip, so they could get their fix. But Blinky wasn't like them. Maybe he didn't have much of a habit to support, or maybe he dealt on the side, but he'd just hang around the supermarket, carry packages home for a quarter or half a buck, take odd jobs, paint apartments, sweep sidewalks, bring down the garbage for the super, and in bad times he'd beg by the subway. One night Blinky overdosed in some basement. Folks said he didn't move an eyelid when the cops carried him to the ambulance. Word got around that he was dead. Someone painted a cross on the sidewalk, put a bouquet of plastic flowers next to a hat, read the Bible, and took a collection. For Blinky's funeral, he said. And the old women walking home from the stores dropped in dimes and quarters. Some stopped to listen to the prayers. 2 weeks later, Blinky returned. He woke up in Lincoln Hospital, stole some clothes and walked out right past the cops and nurses, back to 138th Street, hoping for a fix. When he saw the cross still painted on the sidewalk and found out about our donations, he had some ideas on spending the money, so he and a few friends went looking for the man who took the collection. But no one could ever find him. I think that's a very nice poem. So watch out for this guy. This is W.R. Rodriguez, a very, very, very good poet. In education, not only there are a large number of Hispanic teachers and school principals, but Dr. Dolores M. Fernandez became the president of Hostos Community College in 1999. The Hispanic contribution to the Bronx culture at large has greatly enriched it. Today there are places like Jimmy's Bronx Cafe on Fordham Road and Willie's Steakhouse on Westchester Avenue. They both offer Latin jazz. On a summer Sunday on Orchard Beach, there's often a Latin band playing. Salsa is still played at Manny's West Palm on Bronxdale Avenue. Even the late Tito Puente opened his own restaurant on City Island and often played there himself. Together, all Hispanic groups form the largest ethnic group in the Bronx today. It is estimated that their number is in the vicinity of 50% of the total population of the borough. Hispanics of the Bronx have a great record of accomplishment. They can be proud of it. It is also clear that their story is not yet done. It is clear that Hispanics will contribute more to the history of the Bronx in the future. Thank you. Now, if you have any questions, you could ask me. I don't guarantee an answer, but you can ask. Yes, ma'am.
But you didn't talk about Edgar Allan Poe. He's not Hispanic, I know.
That's right.
But you could have mentioned him.
Well, okay. Edgar Allan Poe. I just mentioned him.
He really was a genius.
Oh, definitely. There's no question. He wrote Annabel Lee and the Bells in the Bronx, by the way.
I'm a telltale heart.
But not in the Bronx. He didn't write. I know, but he wrote Annabel Lee and the Bells while he was living in the Bronx. Yes.
You mentioned the migration of Puerto Ricans from Spanish Harlem
Yeah.
to the Bronx in the 50s, and
Well, it was actually by 1943 that began. Yeah.
by 1943.
In 1943, yeah.
And it started in Mott Haven.
Yeah, they first came to Mott Haven and then almost immediately to Hunts Point as well.
And the pull factor for that was the jobs, right? You said they came.
Well, there were the pull factor for them coming to New York City in the first place was jobs. Remember that the war is going on. Suddenly, there are factory jobs available. Everything is going full tilt. Half the male population is fighting at the front. You need people in the factories, so there are jobs available. And
Pulled Puerto Ricans out of Puerto Rico to New York City.
well, I don't know if it may be Puerto colonialism colonizing New York.
Well, tomorrow, New York will be annexed to Puerto Rico at the New Rican Poets Cafe.
Okay.
But my question was,
Yeah.
the pull factor was the factory jobs that.
Yeah.
Why Puerto Ricans were leaving Spanish Harlem and coming to the Bronx?
Yeah, but there was a push factor as well, because in 1943, and I have to remember Harlem itself is very largely black, and in 1943 blacks were coming up from the south and as well, and they were finding room in Harlem, but it was because of the segregation patterns in the north at the time. The only place they could live was Harlem, and Harlem was getting tremendously overcrowded. And in 1943, there was a riot that broke out in Harlem, and it spilled over into East Harlem. And so even if you're a family that no member of your family took a part in that riot, you're not exactly thrilled about living in the middle of one. Right. And the first thought is, get me out of here. And so they look across the river, and there's Mott Haven.
What about the construction of the projects?
That didn't happen until after the war. There were some projects in New York City that were built before the war, but during the war there was no construction. That would be impossible. Mm-hmm.
And out of the 50% of Latinos that are in the Bronx, how many are Puerto Rican?
I haven't counted them lately. I'm waiting for the census figures, to tell you the truth, because the census was.
I've heard about 1 million. There are 1 million Puerto Ricans in the Bronx.
That would put them well beyond that, because there are 1.2 million people in the Bronx. So if 1 million of them were Puerto Ricans, that would put it way outsize. If you figure that the Hispanic population is roughly 50% of it, it's a little bit more than 500,000 are Hispanic. And I would say that, and this is a sheer guess, I have absolutely nothing in which to base this statement at all, whatsoever. But I would say perhaps half, or perhaps a little more than half of them are still Puerto Rican. But the number of Dominicans coming in are growing, and also, by the way, the number of Mexicans are growing as well.
So, this book, Barnes & Noble?
I got a telephone call that Barnes & Noble up in Bay Plaza, had a copy. I don't know whether it's still on the shelves, but go and take a look. I'd like to know myself. Yes.
In your speech, I didn't see you come across anything in Hispanics making contributions contribution to boxing and in the military that we're in.
Oh yeah, that's true. I obviously, and something like this is difficult to cover at all. Yeah, there are of course very famous Hispanic boxers, but every ethnic group coming in, boxing is always looked upon as one of the first ways out. You know, if I can't get any other way, I'm going to hit my way out of here. So obviously they're
Professionals
yeah.
make a lot of money.
Oh sure, that's the whole idea.
And in the military.
And in the military too. Well, the military is also a way out, especially after the GI Bill was passed in the 1940s.
Awards for bravery and everything.
Oh yeah. Oh definitely, definitely. But you know, since since the American Revolution, no war has been fought on Bronx soil. It's difficult to say, you know, what the contributions of Hispanics were to the Bronx and who were in the military. Well, if that's it, I thank you very much for coming, and I hope you were enlightened. Thank you.